Earth's biodiversity is experiencing a rapid decline due to human activities. Similar to climate change, biodiversity loss presents a systemic risk to people and the planet. For our next discussion, the connection between biodiversity and climate change, we will explore the environmental and social implications of biodiversity loss in the context of a changing climate and the actions investors can take to reduce their impact on biodiversity. First, we welcome Dr. Kathy McKinnon, Chair of the ICUN's World Commission on Protected Areas, to discuss the interconnection among biodiversity, climate stability, and local and global health. Following Dr. McKinnon's discussion, we're excited to share a special message from the Honorable Elizabeth Myrna, Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. In wrapping up our session, I will be joined by Peter Vanderwerth, Senior Engagement Specialist at Robeco, to reflect on the conversation and explore their investor perspective on biodiversity. Dr. McKinnon, over to you.
I'm Kathy McKinnon. I'm the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and I want to talk about biodiversity and climate change and the relationship between them. I particularly like this cartoon by Graham Mackey because I think it illustrates very well the interrelationships between biodiversity, climate change, and over the last year, this terrible pandemic that we've had. We now have a perfect storm of multiple crises. If we look at this slide of global warming, we can see that it's going to have a tremendous impact on our lives. Global warming will impact food security. There'll be falling crop yields in many areas, particularly developing regions. There'll be impacts on water security with significant decreases in water availability in many areas, including the Mediterranean and Southern Africa. We'll have more extreme weather events, and they'll happen more often. We're already seeing the rising intensity of storms, forest fires, droughts, flooding, and heat waves. And global warming is an increasing threat to biodiversity. We're already seeing its impact on natural ecosystems. Ocean warming and acidification, for instance, are already creating extensive damage to coral reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. But while climate change is a threat to biodiversity, biodiversity is also part of the solution to climate change. We have a challenge. We want to hold global warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade. The Paris Agreement is even more ambitious, hoping we can hold it at less than 1.5 degrees centigrade. Yet we know that land conversion, deforestation, and degradation, which are also a significant threat to biodiversity, are responsible for 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So protecting natural habitats is both a benefit for biodiversity and for climate change. Forests cover 35% of the globe, yet they protect 50% of terrestrial carbon. They sequester and remove another 2.4 billion tons of carbon every year. That's equivalent to 1/3 of all fossil fuel emissions. Drylands, grasslands, and wetland ecosystems are also important carbon stores. Area for area, wetlands like peatlands actually sequester more carbon than forests. So it's important that we protect those areas that are important carbon stores, and especially where they are also biodiversity rich. Areas like the Amazon Basin, the Congo Basin, and the tropical forests of Indonesia. And we know the protected areas, national parks and reserves, globally are protecting and storing a minimum 15% of global carbon. Beyond protected areas, we need to improve management in the production landscape, have more sustainable management practices, more sustainable forestry, allowing natural regeneration of forests, managing invasive species, also a threat to biodiversity, but often associated with land degradation, And we need more sustainable agriculture, agroforestry systems, and silvipastoral systems that give benefits for carbon storage as well as biodiversity. And we need to restore. We especially need to restore degraded agricultural lands, both to increase their productivity, but to stop the unrelenting expansion of agriculture into new habitats. We need to rebuild connectivity corridors, establishing linkages between remaining natural habitats that allow species migrations. We need to reforest, but it should be the right trees in the right places. Native species, a diversity of species, and in areas that were previously forested, not impacting on other natural habitats. And we need especially to restore wetlands, which are some of the most degraded and underrepresented habitats remaining. And we need to recognize where we are getting global and local benefits from these activities. When we're talking about biodiversity, we're not just talking about charismatic species like gorillas and tigers and jaguars. We're talking about ecosystem services that underpin human welfare and livelihoods. Protecting natural habitats gives us water security for domestic use, agriculture, and energy production. More than 100 major cities around the world depend on forested protected areas for regular, clean, quality water for domestic use. That includes New York, which derives much of its water from the Catskills, as well as cities like Mumbai and Melbourne. Protecting natural habitats is also good for food security. Protecting pollinators, the animals and insects that achieve pest control. Marine protected areas are renowned for increasing fish stocks and acting as replenishment areas for fisheries beyond their boundaries. Protecting natural habitats, such as mangroves, coastal wetlands, and riverine forests, can help to buffer climate, reduce the impacts of droughts, floods, and storm surges. And we know that healthy ecosystems restrict not just the spread of invasives, but also disease vectors. It's striking that a pandemic like COVID-19 is linked to land clearance and more interactions with wildlife. If we look at a megadiversity area like the Amazon basin, we can see from the slide that the green areas are protected areas, formally protected by governments. The orange areas are indigenous territories. Together, they cover more than 46% of the whole Amazon basin across multiple countries. But they do much more than that. They protect 10% of total global carbon stock. And those Amazon forests are also important for regulating continental and regional weather patterns. So degradation of those forests, conversion for soy, not only impacts on biodiversity and releases greenhouse gases because of land clearance, but also can impact on weather systems, which in turn may influence agriculture going forward. This is going to be an important year for global ambitions. The Biodiversity Convention will hold a big meeting where parties will agree new targets post-2020. The ambition by 2030 is to have 30% of all terrestrial, marine and freshwater ecosystems protected under some kind of conservation measures. Protecting those natural habitats will also be important to the Climate Change Convention, as we know that nature-based solutions can provide more than 30% of cost-effective mitigation actions. But getting to that 30% is going to need much more than formal protected areas. We need to be looking at other measures, areas that are not necessarily managed for conservation, but nevertheless deliver effective biodiversity conservation long term. And many of those areas may be managed by local communities and Indigenous peoples. And then we need to know, well, how do we maintain their support for conservation? Is it through giving them land tenure, making sure that they have security of access and use rights? Is it better spatial planning to make sure that businesses are not being given concessions on their land? We also know that we'll need a much greater investment in those protected and conserved areas. Currently, globally, we spend about $24 billion a year. We know that going forward, to have well-connected, well-managed and effective protected and conserved areas, we'll need to find 5 to 6 times that amount of funding. So how do we go about this? Well, we need some kind of transformational change. We need to stop thinking of these goods and services as free and infinite. We need to be thinking of ways that we can pay for and support them and the communities that help deliver them. We need innovative finance, debt for nature swaps. We need more payments for ecosystem services schemes. Costa Rica has led on this, paying communities to protect forests for carbon, water, and biodiversity. But we also need to be looking at all of these green economic stimulus packages that will come into play post-pandemic and see where there are opportunities, not just to make sure that they do no harm, but to see that they're positive for biodiversity conservation. Where can we have opportunities that link our multiple agendas and give both global and local benefits? It's interesting, for instance, that Pakistan is creating a system of new national parks as part of its climate change strategy, but also to create livelihoods for laborers who have lost their jobs in the cities during the pandemic. So we get biodiversity conservation, climate action, and livelihoods. Similarly, in South Africa, the Working for Water campaigns have successfully increased water flow by removing invasive alien species. They've also reduced the fire load by removing those invasive alien species, and they have created jobs for disenfranchised people from the townships. It's a win-win, particularly as the ultimate beneficiary is biodiversity, restoring the remarkable fynbos vegetation, which is unique to South Africa in the world's smallest floral kingdom. We need to bend the curve for biodiversity. The graph shows, if you look at the black line, how things will continue with business as usual. We've already talked about the greater ambitions for 2030, increasing conservation efforts. That's the yellow line. But to really make a difference, we need to be looking globally across all the production landscapes as well, and increasing conservation efforts there. We need more sustainable production and more sustainable supply chains. And this is where business has a real opportunity to make a difference. And we need to be asking some hard questions. Does it really make sense to be destroying rainforests to plant soy or oil palm for biofuels, for allegedly greener fuels? Does it make sense to be destroying old growth forests in Canada to produce wood pellets for biomass production in Europe? These are tough questions, but where investment and business can really help. We really need to have much more sustainable agriculture and production systems. The World Economic Forum this year and last made biodiversity loss as one of its key risks to the global economy. It's not just conservationists now calling for action on or environmentalists calling for action. It's everybody, economists included. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, has pointed out that the only way forward from the pandemic is to invest in nature and focus on a green recovery to prevent not just future pandemics, but to fight growing environmental threats such as climate change and biodiversity collapse. This is the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. There's never been a more urgent need to restore damaged ecosystems than now. So what do we need to do? We need better spatial planning to avoid areas and protect and restore areas that are important for biodiversity and carbon. But we also need a compact between governments, the business sector, investors, and civil society so that we can all work together for a carbon neutral and biodiversity positive future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McKinnon, for providing the foundation to this discussion. Now let's turn to Ms. Myrna's message before Peter joins me in this discussion.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking the organizers for this timely event and by recognizing the important role business play in fighting the dual battles of climate change and biodiversity loss, also including land degradation. Conserving nature is not only good for the planet, but it is also imperative for businesses. Estimates suggest that our business as usual approach to untargeted land use change and exploitation of natural habitat could cost the world at least $480 billion a year, adding up to $9.9 trillion by 2050. This